Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this panel we have for you today. My name is Alexander Kay. I am the Carl, Harry, and Helen Stoll Chair of Israel Studies here at Brandeis University, and I'm also the director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. Welcome to all of those many of you in the room and many, many more online. I have to give a special hello to Ms. Westrick's class at GAN Academy. She's a former student of ours, and she's bringing her whole class to watch today. And we're really happy about that, as well as all of you who are joining us. Let me give you a brief overview of what's going to happen today. I'm just going to introduce the panel with a few words. And I'm going to introduce our speakers fairly briefly. And the reason for that is we're blessed with quite a large panel today, and each member of the panel has a very long CV, but I'll just introduce them all briefly so that we can keep as much time as possible for the conversation. So the topic of today's panel is the future of Israeli democracy, judicial reform, and political crisis. I think it's fair to say that Israel is currently in the throes of a political, constitutional, and social crisis of possibly unprecedented proportions. Superficially, the crisis is about fairly complex points of judicial reform, which are difficult for non-experts and to some extent even experts to really understand in all of the nitty-gritty detail. But really, this crisis far transcends the detail of the legal points that are being discussed in Knesset committees and extends to really all areas of life in Israel. It's actually difficult to imagine an event short of a full-scale war that would mobilize this amount of political debate and rhetoric and people in the streets in Israel, which has been witnessing tens and actually hundreds of thousands of people in the streets campaigning about these issues week on week. And just to give those of us in the American arena a sense of that, if you imagine sort of per capita what that would mean in an American context, we're talking of weekly demonstrations of millions of people, like maybe imagine 10 million people in the streets of the United States week after week after week. This is arousing a huge amount of debate and exposing all kinds of social rifts that are there in Israeli society. Today, we've assembled a panel that will talk about these issues from all different kinds of angles. And I'm really glad that we have this array of experts who can address these topics from these different perspectives. We're going to open today's panel with Professor Menahem Ben-Sasson, who's sitting here on my right. Professor Ben-Sasson is the Chancellor of the Hebrew University. He is a historian of great renown. And when it comes to this particular topic, his expertise is also particularly relevant because he served as the chair of the Knesset's Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee. Some years ago, he was absolutely pivotal in drafting what could have become, but for various reasons didn't in the end become, a constitution for Israel. And he's actually been present in the Constitution Committee of the Knesset for many of the discussions that have been going on in recent weeks. Professor Ben-Sasson will open today's event with a roughly 10-minute overview just to get people up to speed with the details of what's actually going on in Israeli society right now. We are also joined by Professor Jeffrey Lenowitz, who is the Meyer and W Walter Jaffe Associate Professor of Politics at Brandeis University. Professor Lenowitz is a democratic theorist who works on comparative constitutionalism and constitutional change. He's going to really help us put this whole issue into a comparative perspective. I'm joined also by Professor Yehudah Mirsky, professor at the Eastern and Judaic Studies department here at Brandeis. He's written extensively on religion and politics and law in Israel, and will bring his expertise to bear. We have here Professor Lisa Fishbein Joffe, who is the Shulamit Reinhardt's director of the Hadassah Brandeis Institute and a faculty affiliate in the Department of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies. And she's an expert on women's rights and Jewish family law and the intersection between religious and family law, which are also a particularly hot topic that has been brought to the fore with these recent debates. And we're also joined by Dr. Rima Farah who recently received her PhD from Brandeis University. She was a Schusterman Center Graduate Fellow. We're thrilled to have her here. She's an expert on Arabic-speaking and Palestinian communities inside of Israel, and she's able to help us understand the Palestinian responses to the current crisis. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Ben-Sasson to introduce the topic for us.
Thank you very much for having me, and please bear with my accent and maybe even the vocabulary. We never faced such a crisis. In order to explain what is the level of it, the Holy of the Holiest are the special memorial days that are waiting for us after Passover. The Memorial Day for the Holocaust and the Memorial Day for those who were killed during the Israeli wars. And when I came to this meeting today now, I heard families who usually participate in these ceremonies saying that they have to find a way to protest, even in these ceremonies that never were tagged with such an event, with such a protest against the government, and they may even not come to commemorate the dears who were lost in these events. They have to find a way. So people feel lost, people feel intimidated, and you can see one of the demonstrations here in the slide. It's like a crown surrounding the Knesset, the Parliament, and the Supreme Court, and some 50,000 participated in this event. You can see that events start in the Balfour Declaration, going back to 1917, and the message was at that time, Jews will have an opportunity to build a house for the Jewish people in conditions that are not overriding the rights of the minorities of their time. And soon after, in 1947, the United Nations Decision 181, the partition decision, followed Balfour Declaration and said Jews can build a home for their own, like Palestinians. Two states idea is not an invention of last generation. It was already decided upon in 1947, in condition that each of the two states will do the following: create a military, have a convention of representatives, and decide on constitutions. Each of the states decide on constitution. This constitution will have certain paragraphs referring to minorities, to equal rights, and only after having a constitution, each of the states, Palestinian and Jewish, will elect a parliament and permanent government will continue running the business of each of the states. And they have to guarantee, as you can see in clause number 4, as the United Nations defined it, guaranteeing equal rights, minority rights, freedom of speech, and so on and so forth, as one can read. And towards the end, they mentioned that before these two states come to the United Nations, they have to have a declaration saying that in the future they are going to build a state, they are going to write a constitution, and this constitution is going to cover all elements constitution should cover, as you can see, stipulations that talk about this future. Why it is important? Because in order to build a state recognized by the nations, even by Jewish law, but other needs of the time in the 40s, you had to fulfill certain requirements. And one of them is what was writing a constitution. It took not too long, 1948, when the message came that the Brits leave. The eve of this leaving was Friday, 14th of May, 1948. The Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel was written, and in this declaration, they wrote very clearly that at no time, you have even a date, in few months, we are going to have elections for constitutional assembly, and this constitutional assembly is going to write the constitution, and these will be the future condition of having elections and making of a state, as the United Nations expected us to do. The declaration even hinted, we are going to follow the ideas of the instructions of the United Nations, and these ideas is not only to have a constitutional assembly, but a constitution will be written, equal rights, freedom of A, B, C, and E, will even invite the Arab inhabitants of our area to participate in this endeavor. And they finish with the idea, as you know, partition map was this one, the green was the Arabic area, the yellow was the Jewish area. I don't know if you can see it, and the other, the international area next to Jerusalem and Bethlehem. But it ended up after the war that the majority of the area was covered by the Jewish state or Israeli state, and the purple area was part of Jordan, kept until 1967 to be in the hands of the Jordanians. The system that was built at that time, at the first time, was the following. We'll have elections. The whole country will be one region. It will be by proportion, and then we'll create from the people an a legislative element. From the legislative element, a government will be built, and the executive and the government will be ruled by the majority. So just to make clear to us, while in many places you have more than one chamber, in many places you have more than one region electing, in many places the system of election is more sophisticated. With us, it's simple and clear. Proportional, one region, one chamber. Chamber reflects the power of the government, actually ruled by the government. Who's the balancing power? Only one, judiciary. It took 2 years and 40 different versions of constitutions to realize that we are not going to have a constitution. In this case, a decision was made in the 50s that from now on, we are not going to write a constitution, but series of basic laws. Each of them, when it is finished, has the power of basic law, but it's not a constitution yet. Whenever they gathered, as you can see in the third article, then all of them together become the constitution of the state of Israel. As I said, in 48, 3 versions, 40 constitutional ideas. One of them by D.O. Cohen was unique because he was one of the world's professionals for constitutions. During the years, you can see 13 basic laws were written. Most of them, 11 of them, all the white ones, are dealing only with administrative issues. Only 2 of them, the blue ones, deal with rights of individuals, what we call human rights. So most of human rights are not covered. What are the rules of the game? How do we change basic laws? With you, to amend the Constitution, you know how difficult it is in the United States, not with us. With us, it's like a regular law. So luckily enough, during the years, not only basic laws were written, but also some laws mentioning equality, women's rights, national education, equal opportunities. In these laws, in these bills, you can hear something about equality. Only these 2 laws that I mentioned in 1992 were written, and each of them has a limitation clause. There shall be no violation of the rights under the basic law, this one, basic law, human dignity and liberty, unless you have 3 conditions. 1, it fits the values of the state of Israel. B, it is enacted in a proper process and for proper purposes. And three, the measurements are the measurements required in order to achieve these two goals. So these are the preconditions. In each of these two basic laws, this precondition is mentioned. Therefore, the legislation of 1992 was declared to be kind of a revolutionary change, because Supreme Court saw itself in charge of comparing any new law to these two basic laws, and it rejected, struck down 20 laws since 1991 until nowadays, not befitting these two basic laws. One is basic law, human dignity and liberty, originally voted 32 to 21. Next time it was taken 94, 75 to 0. So don't buy the legends that it was done in dark and it was not improperly voted on. The second one is basic law, freedom of occupation. You can still see the still three conditions. Originally voted 23 to 0. Second time, 67 to 9. A nice majority was made. 2023, new elections created no speech. Government came to power and felt that it can change events, 20 events, one a year, less than one a year, taken by Supreme Court to override, to strike down laws that were written by the Knesset. Why? Because it was made with the power of overriding of the Supreme Court. It was sometimes limited the power of establishing new settlements or having more areas given to the new settlements, or blocking ultra-Orthodox people from their autonomy of rabbinical courts, of the army service, of many of the members of these communities. And there was a resentment that Supreme Court was signed or tinctured with the color of left. Too much liberal, too much open to the needs of the liberal. Let's finish with the verbatim introduction to these series of changes, and you'll see that it's overshadowing all sides of legislative and judiciary activities. First, my watch. I'm finishing in a second. First, says the Minister of Justice, his words, to change the composition of the committee that selects the judges. Up to now, 7 members, 4 of them were members of the government, 3 of them were judiciary. Now it is changed. Secondly, to strengthen the authority's position of the legislator against a war, against the judiciary. Thirdly, to limit the use of reasoning of the Supreme Court when it comes to strike down laws. And that's the purpose. It says changing the makeup of the judicial selection, limiting the Supreme Court power, and granting Knesset over the superpower overriding decision of Supreme Court. So you felt already, in order to block Supreme Court, you did 3 things. 1, you limited the number of justices and professionals in the committee. 2, you didn't give permission to the Supreme Court to strike down laws of the Knesset. 3, you gave the Knesset the power to override the Supreme Court decisions. Who are going to suffer? All minorities. People who usually suffer can apply Supreme Court and now should be stopped because the law doesn't allow it. So let's go fast over the decisions. 1, judicial selection, you can see, it said, I'm back to here. It says, excuse me, back, sorry for using the time. So it says, started with this one. This is a new one, selection. So it says now that you can have 11 members, but still the majority of the coalition. not of the opposition. They do not have a say, but two voices. So this is the new committee. Secondly, judicial review will not be allowed only on regular laws, but only if 15 justices come to the same conclusion, who can have 15 justices come to the same conclusion. You do not have an opportunity to bring core law after it was overridden to the Supreme Court. Thirdly, judicial review. Thirdly, Knesset can override in advance. And secondly, post-judicial review, there is no chance. I mean, Knesset can override. Thirdly, legal advisors will not be anymore the gatekeepers. They can only give an advice, like your lawyer. If you don't like it, take somebody else. Nowadays, they have the right to stop the government from making any other laws. So this is the problem when it comes. We change the whole system, and the reasoning is deleted completely from the set of arguments of Supreme Court. They cannot use it anymore. I'm done. I just want to say a word about the method. It is cruel. It doesn't have an opportunity, it doesn't give an opportunity to the opposition to talk. That's not the way you make laws, not to speak about constitutional processes. Thirdly, it's changing the rules of the game while the game is still running. Then it is not behind the veil of ignorance. Whenever you're doing constitution, you wait 4 years and then the other parliament decides whether to adopt it or not. No, everything is going to be implemented tomorrow morning. It's harsh, it's accumulated to accumulative tools and contradictory items and redundant articles. It's not an accident that the president of the state of Israel that hasn't got any authority interfered and brought 6 pages, you can read it afterwards, of six pages of 60 articles explaining how does he see the future. Among them, basic laws will be done differently, committee will be different, and government will not have majority, and so on and so forth. People feel threatened. People go back to the values of the making of the state of Israel, and they ask themselves, are we participating with these activities? Many say no. And what you see is part of the reflections that I started with. Thanks.
Professor Ben-Sasson, thank you so much for the overview of a really complicated topic. What we're seeing then, and the critics of this process are very clear about it, is essentially the removal of the power of the Supreme Court to exercise judicial review, a real threat to any kind of checks and balances in the Israeli governmental system, effectively giving whichever government is in power carte blanche to do whatever, to execute whatever policies it sees fit. We're talking here, in Professor Ben-Sasson's words, about a real threat to the minorities, and there are, of course, significant numbers of minority communities inside of the state of Israel. All of this being carried out in a process which is unprecedented and doesn't really give the opportunity for democratic input. And beyond that, we're also seeing questions of, beyond even the judicial overhaul itself, we're seeing calls among government, not just officials, but government ministers and cabinet members to bring in a more of a theocratic bent to Israeli politics and law. And occasionally, not rarely, more than rarely, these kinds of calls are carried out with an extremely inflammatory, often openly racist rhetoric by people sitting in the government. President Biden saw fit to call Netanyahu just yesterday, I think it was, to remind him of the importance of liberal rights and values. And in Professor Ben-Sasson's words, all of this goes against the founding values of the state of Israel itself. Therefore, I'm going to now turn to Professor Mirsky, and I want to ask you, Yehudah, it's easy to come up with a list of criticisms and I don't think that we'll be hard put to do that. But these reforms are additionally supported by a significant number of Israelis, a minority, but a significant number. So can you lead us through the ideologies that lead to the support for these?
Thank you for convening this panel. So like one little caveat right at the beginning, I myself personally am dual citizen of the US and the state of Israel. I'm very opposed to these judicial reforms. I've physically gone to protests when I'm there, and from here I'm involved in helping to organize protests and raise money for them and so on and so forth. So I'm just putting that on the table because I'm going to try to convey what the supporters of this reform, how they think of this. I mean, also one has to say that there is this entire process that we're watching. There were necessary conditions and sufficient conditions. And I'll be talking about the necessary conditions, which is to say the underlying dynamics, political, cultural, et cetera, that are driving this. The sufficient condition was Mr. Netanyahu, formerly a great defender of the judiciary and the rule of law, as historically was the Likud party, one should remember. Menahem Begin famously announcing, Yesh Shoftim b'Yerushalayim, there are judges in Jerusalem, etc. And Mr. Netanyahu used to talk like that, and his concluding that his personal interest sort of dictates a radical revision of the powers of the judiciary. And indeed, he would, and this is where it starts getting to a substantive argument, the very fact that the people have elected me so sweepingly, despite my criminal indictments, tells you that the judiciary is no longer legitimate in the eyes of the populace. Now, what's interesting here is that to the extent to which there's an argument that's being made here, a lot of it, there's large arguments here going on about the meaning of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, right? As in the United States, at times the judiciary is becoming the place where people fight out questions or try to resolve issues of politics and identity that where maybe not judiciary is the ideal forum for them, but that's where they get fought out. And it's also no accident because a number of the key players here were educated or spent a significant amount of time in America and in and internalizing values of American legal establishment. Now, if we look at, so what are the arguments that we're making here? First, there's an argument in terms of democracy, and I'm sure Professor Lenowitz can speak about this far more articulately than I. The will of the people. What is democracy? Democracy is the will of the people. The will of the people is that the people want this coalition government, and the people want this, and judges are unelected, etc. If you ask, say, Simcha Rotman, the chairman of the Judiciary Affairs, current chairman of the Knesset's Judiciary Affairs Committee, what, the will of the people is a unitary thing? It's all one thing, there aren't compromises? Says, of course not. The will of the people, of course, is comprised of compromises. The compromises that are contained in the coalition agreement between the various governing parties, the sum total of legally and constitutionally meaningful compromise is encapsulated in the documents that create the governing coalition. That's the legal theory. And it's this sense of the people. It's a certain kind of, yes, extremely populist sense of the will of the people. Now, if we look at some of the, first of all, also one needs to say that there have been Israeli liberals who have been very critical of Israel's judicial activism over the decades, because Israel's court has been extremely activist, even by American standards. I mean, we could go into the details in the question and answer, but the Israeli court, especially under the presidency, the chief justice is called the President Court, the presidency of the very brilliant jurist Aaron Barak, went much farther than American liberal judges in asserting different forms of judicial supremacy and so forth. In part doing that because as over time, the Supreme Court came to see itself as like the last ditch defending Israeli democracy. But others would say, no, they're the last ditch defending the old Israeli elites, right? So really the Israeli labor, socialist, liberal-minded elites that ran the country and have been sort of in retreat ever since the disaster of the 1973 war, have only been able to hold on to a few institutions. The argument goes, one is the academy, the other is portions of the press, and most importantly, the judiciary. And this argument is sociologically not entirely without merit. Now, if we look at the groups pushing this thing, there's several. There's religious Zionism, right? Now, religious Zionism as a movement, there's the party, but religious Zionism is a much more multifarious movement than people know. Indeed, one of our other doctoral students, Yehudah Mirsky, recently wrote a wonderful dissertation on left-wing socialist religious Zionists earlier on in the 20th century. The religious Zionist camp, and here there's the religious Zionist camp has been always the camp that on the one hand, maintains does not share in Zionism, sense that it is rebelling against Jewish tradition, Jewish religion, which was a key dispensation of secular Zionism, but is joining forces with it. Now, today, in the felicitous formulation of my friend Tila Friedman, a former member of Knesset, she said, today the religious Zionist camp is split in two. Those who see themselves as partners with secular Israel, and those who see themselves as the true elite, leaving secular Israel behind, which would be Bezalel Smotrich, right? And also, this is something we get into in the Q&A. If you want to understand what sort of political social type he comes from, he's essentially a religious version of Leninism. You know, I know where history is going, you don't. I've studied how government works, and I know how to run this thing. Please step aside. I mean, he's very different from his coalition partner, Itamar Ben-Gvir. We could talk about that later. You have the ultra-Orthodox, who, as always, their primary goal is to secure the funding and the institutional base for their own separate and distinct institutions. The ultra-Orthodox approach to politics in Israel and America tends to be less ideological as such and highly transactional. They're not interested in debates about the nature of Zionism and the meaning of Jewish statehood. They want to make sure that their institutions are secure, their prerogatives are secure, their budgets are secure, and they will tell you, by the way, we're the real Jews anyway, so why not, right? Doesn't you call yourself a Jewish state, don't you? And you have right and conservative populists, and here you have two sorts. You have say people like Yariv Levin, the current justice minister, who again very much shares this populist critique of the judiciaries, who are these unelected judges to be telling us, to be telling people what to do. We have to restore democracy to the will of the people. And as always, there's no small class and ethnic resentment among, and it's a pity that our colleague Yuval Ivri couldn't be here because of very sad death in his family, because he and I have had wonderful exchanges about this. Mizrahi Jews of non-European origin, who have their own reasons for being angry with the old elites. I mean, because there have been all sorts of socioeconomic injustices in Israel over the years, and often their sense of socioeconomic injustice, and this is a crucial lesson for Israel as for America, they don't kindle to the way liberals talk about them. After all, you're oppressed. We're trying to liberate you. Why don't you want us to let us liberate you? Right? That doesn't really fly. What do you mean liberate? We're the soul of the Jewish people. Who are you? Right? Why are you talking down to us like this all the time? I mean, that's a very crucial feature of everything that's going on here. And this is with this I will end. The center left in Israel, which I voted in the last election, came by its defeat quite honestly, because for years now it's been really unclear just what the center left is for. It hasn't had a strong ideological position. A lot of this has to do with the defenestration of the Israeli left on security grounds by the 2000 Intifada, a whole bunch of the disastrous way in which the 2005 disengagement came out. Oh, and one more thing I absolutely have to say, if you talk to settlers, they will tell you, hey, okay, we overdid it during the Oslo. First off, when it came to the Oslo Accords, we're the Messianic people here. We're the crazy Messianists. What's the new Middle East? What's America's now the benign hegemon of the world? What's Yasser Arafat is going to become a peace lover? And we're the crazy Messianists. Okay. So, but we overdid it during Oslo. When it comes time for the Gaza disengagement, the protests by and large were peaceful, with the exception of some activists, including Bezalel Smotrich, now the finance minister. And if you talk to them, they'll say, all our protests were nonviolent. Our rhetoric was much milder. When they told us to leave our homes, we did. And what did they do? You hold the referendum on the disengagement. It doesn't go the way you like it. Okay, the referendum doesn't count. Ariel Sharon polls his party. Oh, my party's against it. Fine, I'll switch parties. So you keep breaking the rules, and then we're supposed to follow the rules. One can't underestimate the sense to which the Gaza disengagement of 2005 and the disastrous way it was handled by the Israeli political system generated this enormous politics of resentment, even by good faith people. Finally, the last comment. In the remarkably interesting, dynamic, vital discussions about the meaning of Jewish identity in a Jewish and democratic state, much of the Israeli center left has simply been absent for a very long time. Right? And that's why if you take a look, the most interesting culture pages in the country tend to be in the right-wing newspapers, because they take culture seriously and they take literature seriously and they take the arts seriously. Part of what's been so interesting to watch here, and actually we're actually taking hope from everything that's going on, however this all turns out, is to see the Israeli center left finally coming together and also realizing that, under the strong neoliberalism of recent years, all the strong bonds of solidarity that used to be in the center left, the kibbutzim and the moshavim and the labor federations and all that are gone, and where it's left is on the right in the settlements and in the synagogues. And so I like to think that the Israeli center left is rediscovering some of its energy and passion and ideas and community. I hope I'm not being too hopeful there. Thank you.
So, Professor Lenowitz, let me turn to you now. Both of our speakers so far have, on more than one occasion, made comparisons between what's going on in Israel and what's going on in other places. And on the ground in Israel, those kinds of comparisons are always made. You know, pro and anti-reform people are saying, but in this other country, it's done in this way, or it's not done in this way. So you're actually the comparativist that can actually answer this with expertise rather than rhetoric. So let me just ask you, how does this fit into wider trends of populist rhetoric, judicial reform, etc., in various countries around the world? And I'll just add on a second question as well, which is, do the critiques of the government, by the government, of the judiciary actually hold water? Is there a democratic critique that says courts should be disempowered or limited in their power? And if so, how does it actually play out in the details, which are obviously, you know, where the real important questions lie?
Yeah, so thank you for having me on this panel, and those are excellent questions. So first, it certainly fits into a global trend, but not a trend that anyone wants to be a part of. Right, all around the world, for decades, we've seen religiously infused right-wing parties gain control with kind of charismatic executives, gain control of democracies, and quickly realize that what is going to be their biggest nuisance is a court, and then quickly enact a program of simultaneously disempowering that court and also having a hand in how it's selected. I think the most obvious example, and people are writing on this, just how close of an example is what Orban did in Hungary. As soon as Fidesz got the right kind of supermajority, not really a supermajority, but the nature of Hungarian election laws, you get a supermajority even if you don't actually. But anyway, quickly enacted on a program that was very, very similar. What you first do is get really involved in how justices are appointed. Then they moved with retirement ages, lowered those to kick people out, then started having as much kind of maximum control starting in 2010, while also limiting the power of the judiciary. And then what happens, which is happening now, is once you have complete control of the judiciary, then you start giving it power again. And we see a similar thing happening, you know, before we all loved what was going on in Poland because of the Ukraine-Russian war. People were criticizing Poland for doing the very same thing, right? The dominant political party was gaining control of the judiciary and then recently passed mechanisms to discipline justices who did things that parties didn't want. You see Modi having a similar structure and struggle in India. They tried to pass a failed amendment, which would have given them more control over appointment. And instead now they're just not nominating people. Turkey, so there's many stories around the world of a very similar thing happening. And it's not a trend anyone wants to be a part of, or at least, I mean, Netanyahu maybe does, but it's something that should be looked on in kind of a scary fashion. In regards to the critique of the government regarding the balance of power, I mean, anyone here, and there's several of you who've taken courses with me, know that, I can't help, no matter what I'm teaching, to start complaining about the power of the Supreme Court in the United States and how annoying it is and how powerful they are. But a critique of the power of a court needs to take into consideration the broader constitutional framework. And that is what my fellow panelists have already said is an important piece of the story. It's hard, and I don't think there is, to imagine another country where the result of one election leads to complete control of the state. The closest approximation would be England, but you have a second house of delaying power. You have the European Court of Human Rights. You have a very strong tradition of norms. You have various different checks. That's the closest. And even there, it's very different. One election, and I think that's the key. One result of one election leads to complete control of the state. So the critique of an independent judiciary doesn't have as much bite when there really are no other checks. And I think it's important to take into consideration the institutional framework that surrounds particular provisions, because some of the rhetoric that's being used to defend the particular reforms is engaging in what some scholars, Landau and Dixon, call abusive constitutional borrowing. That's when you look at, right now, constitutional democracy norms are still strong. And what you do is you point to features in other constitutions and say, we're just borrowing those. So let's think of the legislative override clause, right? You can point to Canada and say in Canada, they can override their Supreme Court decisions. They have that feature. They do it, it's not used that often, but it's there. Why can't we have it? If that's okay and not criticized in a kind of stable constitutional democracy, why is it problematic here? And what's important is to look at the different distinctions between these governments, right? Canada has a rigid constitution. It has federalism. It has that override provision is only lasts for 5 years. It's temporary, allowing for a next election to kick it out. So there's all of these different inherent checks. Or look at the claim about how can you complain about politicizing the process of selecting Supreme Court justices, you Americans? Can you imagine a more political process for selecting Supreme Court justices than what's in the United States? And of course, you probably can't, but there's still differences, right? Look at the people who have power to select Supreme Court justices in the United States. There are people who have different constituencies from different elections, right? The Senate is staggered. They're elected by people within states. The president is elected from all of the population of the United States via the Electoral College. So there are inherent checks there from the results of one election. And also look at the degree to which Supreme Court and federal judges are accountable to the government in power. It's only at the beginning, right? Their selection. Then they have life appointments. What's being proposed in Israel, that kind of tether between the government and the justice would remain, because it would be easier to get rid of them, whether we're talking about 7-9 or a majority vote in the panel, where in the United States to get rid of a federal judge requires an impeachment procedure, which is very difficult, right? A majority in the House, a supermajority in the Senate, very unlikely. And if you have the override clause, then you have constantly dangling around justices the fact that their work is going to be overruled, which is the last thing any justice in any judicial system wants, because as we know about judicial branches, they care deeply about their legitimacy. So you have this double means of connecting the judiciary to the government that isn't the same. But the move, again, is to overlook the fact that different constitutional systems are set up in different ways and to make recourse to these. Look, all these things are fine. Why can't we do that? So, yeah, I mean, for me, this interesting is, as someone who loves talking about how we need to get rid of our independent judiciary or weaken them substantially, it's hard to look at this. There seems to be something wrong here, but it's important to just think of the existing checks in the system. And again, you couldn't design a government where the result of one election would allow complete capture of every aspect of the state better than what Israel has. I mean, that's why, depending upon how you read the historical record, the judiciary did on its own expand its power. Because to the question of what is democracy, is it just, a bare majority at a moment of time doing it? A lot of people have moved away from that. We're thinking you need to have worry about some minority rights protections or some sort of stable procedures. And you only get that by having either a stable constitution, which doesn't exist in Israel, right? It can be changed in the same sort of procedures, or by having other branches that can at least check the results of one election, or even different members of that legislative branch that come from different elections. Again, that's an important thing. It's all at once. So,
Thank you so much. So I'm going to turn now to Professor Fishbein Joffe, who has written and worked for many, many years about regarding ways that Israel's judicial structure affects women and LGBTQ people in Israel. And this has a lot to do, especially with the laws of marriage and divorce in Israel. The judicial structure in Israel is such that Israel is in some ways fairly progressive, actually, when it comes to, let's say, LGBTQ issues. But at the same time, the judiciary is set up that religious courts, not just Jewish, but religious courts in general, have exclusive control over aspects of law that pertain to marriage and divorce. And I'm wondering what you think will change or might change regarding especially the vulnerability or otherwise of women, LGBTQ people in Israel. What's being threatened here, and what might change if the reforms go through?
Thank you. And thanks for including me on the panel. I'm concerned about the implications of these reforms for women's rights in Israel, as are many activists and academics who I'm in discussion with. There are a range of rights that women enjoy in the state of Israel that come from legislation, but many of them come from decisions that have been made by courts to expand those rights. They include rights to protection from discrimination, violence against women, representation in the Knesset, equality in military service, implementation of equal pay for equal work, all core rights fundamental to their equality. I want to focus in particular on rights that have been won by religious feminists in Israel through the courts, and rights related to domestic violence, both of which I think are at risk under this new regime. Some of the rights that have been won through the courts for religious women include rights to equal shares of family property on divorce, rights to serve on local religious councils, rights to serve on committees that select rabbinical court judges, the right to immerse in the mikveh in ways that are suitable to your own practice rather than are imposed by rabbis from the outside. The right to ride a public bus without having to sit in the back of the bus or be subject to mandatory sex segregation in transportation and also in other public events. The right to have your own voice heard on the radio. There was a case involving a religious station that found it immodest to play the voices of any woman on the radio. That included people running for the Knesset, that included important messages about public safety, that included women who might want to call in and have something to say on a call-in show. And that was struck down by the courts as a violation of equality. Other cases that have been brought on behalf of religious women include ones in which the rabbinical court, which had sought to retroactively invalidate a divorce granted on an innovative basis to an aguna, to a woman denied a religious divorce by another court that it didn't agree with, that they were told by the secular courts that that was beyond their powers and told to get back in their lane. Also, the right to be included on the electoral lists of Haredi parties is something that has come about through judicial action. So that's what's happened in the past, and all those things are vulnerable to being reversed. But we also see things in terms of the proposed legislation brought forth by this new government. For example, proposed legislation sought to prohibit women from praying at the Wailing Wall, the Kotel, using talit and tefillin, on threat of being subject to penalties that included up to 6 months in jail. That legislation, Netanyahu has said they won't proceed with it this round, but it gives you some indication of what they have in mind. Also, the Religious Affairs Ministry, which had a practice of providing an opportunity for women to take tests that are similar to the rabbinical ordination test in order to make women eligible to serve in religious leadership positions. They've just stopped offering the test. What does that mean? I don't know. It could mean that that the pathway to serve in those positions is being cut off. I want to conclude by talking about remedies around domestic violence that may be at issue. Right now, you probably know that divorce is a matter that is subject only to the rabbinical courts in Israel. There is no civil marriage and no civil divorce. And an issue that has emerged in a number of recent cases are situations in which a woman is seeking to divorce a man who has been convicted of domestic violence against her, who is serving time in jail for, let's say, attempted murder or violent assault, and has gone to the rabbinical court and asked that they tell the husband that he must divorce her. And in a number of notorious cases, rabbinical courts around the country have said no. That continues to happen. It happened last week in a case brought by the Center for Women's Justice in the Haifa Rabbinical Court, in which they refused to act. Part of what this new government proposes is not to limit the power of rabbinical courts, but to expand their jurisdiction into other areas of life, so that those who might not choose to go to rabbinical court may be subject to their rule and their views on women in other areas of their lives. This new government also has declined to proceed with ratification of the Istanbul Convention. In the prior Knesset, the government had started the process of signing on to that convention, which provides comprehensive remedies to victims of domestic violence. It would have required innovations in law and innovations in education that would provide more comprehensive protection. This government has indicated it will not proceed with signing on to the Istanbul Convention. There is also legislation that was brought forth by the previous government, which would have provided for electronic monitoring of people who have a restraining order against them for domestic violence. And it would allow for geolocation of somebody who has a restraining order that prevents them from coming within 100 yards or 100 meters of the person being protected. This government has also said they don't want to proceed with that legislation. They want to go back to the drawing board because they feel it's unbalanced and doesn't provide enough protection to men. So I'll also conclude by pointing to some statistics. Naomi Chazan, in a piece in the newspaper yesterday, cited a February 2023 poll from the Israel Democracy Institute that said that women are very worried about these reforms. 45% of women oppose the introduction of the override clause, opposed to 19.5% who support it. 65% of women object to the attempt to limit the ability of courts to strike down unreasonable laws. Only 23% approve of it. And 63% of women believe that changes proposed by the government would adversely affect gender equality, and only 21% are not particularly concerned. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Let me turn now to Dr. Farah, and if you probably need the microphone closer. Thank you.
Yes.
So it's something like 20% of the citizens of Israel are Arab Israelis or Palestinian citizens, Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. And I'd just like to hear from you, Dr. Farah, about how these people are responding to the potential for these judicial reforms. As you've written about extensively in your own research, and it kind of goes without saying in a way, Israel's Palestinian communities are not homogenous. They differ in terms of religion, regional affiliation, political ideology, religiosity, and all kinds of things. And I'd love to get some sense of the complexion of the differences of opinion as regard to this overhaul. And just finally, I wonder if you can also say a word about what we're seeing in the news all the time, which is that the debates going on in Israeli society are unfortunately not stopping at speech alone, but there's been a substantial amount of violence, both of Jews against Palestinians and Palestinians against Jews in Israeli society. Now, this is not the first time that's happened, obviously. And I wonder if you may also say a word about whether it's just coincidentally accompanying what's going on in terms of the judicial reforms, or are these things actually linked?
Yes, thank you. Well, all what's happening in the region, actually, you said it's not new. All the attacks, it's mutual attacks, Palestinians on settlers, settlers on Palestinians. This has been the case for many years. And, and negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians through Egypt, Jordan, and through the United States have always been going on. However, actually, what you can see on the news, on the media in Israel, is that more people, they say that more Palestinians were killed during the Bennett-Lapid government, but we'll have to wait and see. Probably the number will change. But for now, we think about what's really the difference, what's happening now that is different than what was previously. In previous governments, you see that the approach was different. The Israeli leadership was more concerned about how to stop the violence, about whether, regardless of who is right and who is wrong, there were attempts to build strategies, to be more political, to be more smart, and not to escalate the situation. Now, the big difference is that we have a more radical government that we can say it legitimizes actually what's happening, because if one incident, small incident happens, then the response is let's erase the entire village, or let's just kill everyone, okay? So Israeli leaders have never had this approach, regardless of what they thought, but they had never responded in this way, but they tried to be smart and political and to find ways to stop it. So I would say that there's not much new in terms of what's happening and the violence, but I would really say that the current government is giving it a different face and make it appear as if it's becoming more and more radical. For the Arabs in Israel, it's important to the Arabs are not flocking into the streets, obviously. And to understand why this is happening, I think we should first maybe look a little bit into the nature of the reforms and in what context they are taking place. Because the reforms and laws and policies in Israel can take place on different levels. On the state level, within the Jewish context, the Jewish and democratic context of the state, and that's what's happening. There's an intra-Jewish debate over who is a Jew and what is the identity of the Jewish state, how much religion should control the state, how much ethnicity is important for the Jews, and the relationship between religion and ethnicity, secularism and religion. That has been an issue for the Jews for a long time, and that's what's happening today is happening within this specific context, the context of the Jewish and democratic state. On a different level, you have the Arabs in Israel, and there have been many policies, laws, reforms that concern directly the Arabs in Israel. And this has been the case since 1948 through enactment of laws, or maybe trying to reform the education system, agriculture, or to restrain the Arabs from try to prevent the threat that the Arabs constitute to the state, policies regarding the Palestinians, the occupation. All these issues that pertain directly to the Arabs will actually concern the Arabs. And now the Arabs think that this is time to talk when it concerns their interests. For example, if the judiciary issue and the reforms are important, and they know that eventually that's going to affect them. But it's a Jewish thing, and the Jews are doing a good job. So the majority is doing the job. They are on the sideline, and there are people out there like social activists releasing videos of social activists and Knesset members, including the mayor of Fahim, including author like Muhammad Ali Taha in Israel, and they say you should come out. People should listen to you, hear your voice, because we do have some crumbs of of democracy from Israel. We have to keep whatever we have. I mean, at least keep this. We don't want to lose everything. And there's a harsh criticism on that's saying, no, we will not go out on the streets because, to begin with, it's a Jewish thing. It's not about Israel's resistance to the existence, about the Arabs' resistance to the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. So you can find here, for example, the death penalty for terrorist bill that has been approved by the cabinet. That would evoke the anger of the Arabs. And now you can see demonstrations like in Sakhnin, in the city of Sakhnin in the north of Israel. You can see demonstrations. Even Ahmad Tibi, he quoted Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. Yes, he was very proud to say, and even Shas is against that bill, against the death sentence for terrorists. So you can see sometimes Jewish and Arab, ethics do align. I mean, in this case, this is one of the cases. So you can find and there are attempts to tell the Arabs to go on the streets, but at the same time, they know that it does not pertain to their existence as a minority within Israel. Now, in terms of responses in general, if you go, into each group's, specifically how each group responds. Now, if you look at the Druze, for example, you see the Druze has, their major concern is citizenship, is the common cause. So when the Jews they were disgruntled and were upset from the nation state law. And since then, you can see that their participation in these kind of demonstrations are not also very effective. And but usually their attempt to participate in these demonstrations, it stems from the fact that they are active citizens of the Jewish and democratic state. It's not because they want to change the Jewish identity of Israel as being Jewish and democratic the way it defines itself. If you look at the Arabs, at the Christians, for example, the Christians do not constitute any pressure. They are not an organized community. the Christians are part of the Arab society, and whatever the Arab Muslim society dictates, they will usually follow in order not to create any anger or any frustration or any conflicts within Arab society. The Arabs in general are sitting on the sideline, but what they think is democracy is in danger. But it's important to say something about democracy in Arab society, because Arab society, you know, we think that democracy in Israel is in danger. But what kind of democracy is in danger? It's the Jewish and democratic state, okay? So there is the Jewish factor, the Jewish aspect in the democracy, in the identity of the state. It's not a liberal democracy, and perhaps liberal democracy will not work in Israel. But for the Arabs, they use the discourse of liberal democracy, although they did not inherit democratic values. Arab society in Israel is not a democratic society, to be, you know, honest. It's not a democratic society, but it does use the discourse of a liberal democracy in order to reject and defy the kind of democracy that Israel is offering, which is Jewish and democratic. So there are different democracies happening here, there, and, you know, we have a balagan, and everyone is coming with a different type of democracy, saying this is the right democracy. But at the end, democracy is like a genie in a bottle. It's like, it's in the Middle East, and in Arab society, it is hidden, it is forbidden, but it's also grant wishes. So whenever it's available to help to achieve certain goals and to, to fulfill political interest, then it is used by these communities. So you don't see, if you see people on the streets, they're holding the Palestinian flag, of course, and not the Israeli flag, because again, it's in the context of Arab society resisting Israel. It's not in the context of the state on that level, the level of the state, where they are talking about citizenship in general. It's always, there's a segregation. There are differences between the two levels, the state level and the Arab level. And in the last 5 elections, we saw that the boundaries were blurry a little bit, because the whole question was for all communities, like it was to Bibi or not to Bibi. It's like that was what intended, yeah. And eventually, except having a small cocktail government that we had for a short time, it was to Bibi, of course, the answer was. And that's when this government, radical government now, is influencing everyone, but whatever is happening is on the state level, and the minorities respond only when it concerns them in a direct way.
Thank you so much. We now have about 10 minutes to open up for questions from the floor. And I would just say, in addition to this 10 minutes that we have at the end of our broadcast Zoom panel, I'm going to encourage any students who want to stay around. The panelists have very graciously offered to stay around for a sort of more informal conversation. There'll be pizza also. And you're all very welcome to stay for that after the formal panel ends. Questions from the floor. And Mung Chi is coming around with a microphone. Professor Katz is right in front of you. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. You focused a lot on the legal elements, but I think there's another part which has been left out, which is the dafka element. A lot of the rules, regulations, and laws which are being passed are simply made to show who is now in charge. For example, the law that says that Israeli taxpayers have to pay for all 3 of Netanyahu's houses, including the mansion in Caesarea that no one is allowed to enter, including his family. When I say taxpayers, I mean the 20% of the Israeli population that pays for 90% of the taxes. The law that says that we need to spend 80,000 shekels on Netanyahu's suits. The law that they're being passed this week that says it's going to be a crime to bring a packet of Doritos into a hospital on Passover, as if the Russian and Arab security guards can become kashrut inspectors. They tried to pass a law saying you can't have cultural events on Saturday. Let them try it with football. Now, the point of these laws is to make someone like me sitting in Talat Sfarim down the street from my house in Tel Aviv understand that there's a new balabayit in town, that they're ruling now and we have to come back. So it's not just a legal revolution, it's a cultural revolution, which is exactly why we can never give up. Even if they change these rules, they're constantly going to pass these dafka laws just to show who is in charge. And I think that's an element that needs to be addressed as well.
Thank you. Menahem, would you like to say a word to that?
Yes, being a neighbor of Netanyahu, next door to us, having 10,000 guests each Saturday night at home, I do agree, A, with the description, and two, part of on the contrary, as you said, some people think, but I would like at least to draw the line between these minutiae in many ways to the main issues. It's the first time that a constitutional issue came back to fore in a power that we just hear about. All around Israel, people were not aware of the basic values that they were fighting for, and it is not the drinking of Mrs. Netanyahu. You haven't mentioned it, it's part of the game. So the dissatisfaction is one issue. But when it comes to the basics, people start to A, refuse, B, they are not going to pay taxes, completely, including myself. We are not going to obey, passive obey. We are not going to teach. It's an issue. This level of rejection has a lot to do not with the minutiae of the issues that you mentioned, it's another level. So I would fully agree with it. And to add to it, just to support it, what are the bills that the government now runs in a situation that it promised 6 months ago to deal with security and with the financial status of the needy? You are right.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here. It seems to me like the Israeli right that's in power now is committing like the first sin of politics, which is thinking you're always going to be in power. Like these sort of judicial reforms and legislative supremacy only really work for the right if the right is controlling the legislature and the executive. So why do they think that the left is never going to win again, or do they? Are they just like, is this just short-term thinking, or do they have some sort of long-term plan to sort of try to remain in power for all of eternity?
So thank you. I'm going to ask Yehudah to briefly respond, and Jeffrey, if you would also like to respond, because the same questions seem to be relevant for Hungary and other places too.
Well, it's an excellent question. Part of it is short-termism. Part of it is I have power now, so let me get as much as I can, and then we'll kick that can down the road. Part of it is demographics. I mean, so like the remarkable growth of ultra-Orthodox communities and also religious Zionist communities. So people think, actually, we will go on being the majority. Also, the extent to which the judiciary and the liberal judiciary is associated with some sort of political accommodation with the Palestinians, well, to the extent to which people think that's off the table for one reason or other, they can go right ahead. So I think there's a lot to say, but I think those are some of the concerns why people might actually think, yeah, we will be running everything.
Great question. I mean, exactly what was just said. Also, if you look at the comparative cases, well, then once you do this, then you start changing things so you don't lose. Whether the coalition has that in mind, I mean, that's why you do this, right? Orban did this so he could amend the constitution unilaterally and change the electoral law and gerrymander the state so he couldn't get out of power. So that's next. Whether that actually is going to happen is an open question. And also sometimes, another thing of this is just has to do with the problem of liberals or people on the left of not being willing to abuse institutions in the same way. Right? I mean, you can give them that opportunity, but look at the kind of relatively recent reluctance of Democrats to really engage in hardcore gerrymandering in the same way. I mean, New York tried, but then they canceled their own map. So part of it is just that, like, we're the people who use these weapons. The other people aren't going to.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. Almost like a follow-up to Mikey's question, but a lot of this seems to be like we don't care what anybody else thinks, like either Jewishly or globally. So how much of this would you say is like I guess an a priori, like we don't care what other people think we're doing this, or is just not recognizing what other people think? How much is this a global conversation that is being had in Israel? How much is it just we want to do what we want to do, screw you all? That's the best way I can put it. Sorry.
I think that question could be addressed to anybody. I'm open to takers. Rima, is that something you'd like to?
Well, I can refer to the Middle East, for example. I mean, if you look at the media and The Middle East actually is describing Israel as like, as a place that is being disassembled. There's something happening there, like some radicals or those who think that, vehemently against Israel do see Israel as, like it's like the end. It's like, look what's happening. That's what's anticipated. Like the Jews among themselves are now fighting, and this is actually the end. You can find this in some media, and in some media in the Middle East actually will also look at it, more objectively, just explaining what's happening and referring to the government as being the radical government that is destroying Israel's democracy. And you can find also some voices referring and using words like the terrorist government. As if like there are no terrorist governments in the Middle East, but it's just like, when it comes to Israel, it's like easier always to point and say that's a terrorist government. So it's interesting how the Middle East is watching, and you can see that some are enjoying and some are kind of, trying to analyze it more objectively. Yeah.
And Dr. Shachal had a question right here in the front.
Thank you. I have two questions. Continue to your question, why maybe the right continue to win. Do you think that is there any debate in the Arab population about changing the basic law of the Knesset, of who can run to the Knesset? Because this is the key, at least for now, as I can see it. You can see it from the coalition agreements that they signed beforehand. This is the key where the right can keep in power for the next future. This is, they don't need to go to other places.
Who can run to the Knesset?
Yeah, they're going to disqualify some Arab parties, and this is enough because you see the result of the last elections. This is enough to make the right maintain in
the
power.
Threshold, you mean?
Yeah,
Oh,
no,
okay.
not the threshold. The 7A.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is the first thing that they will run against them. I mean, not first. And my second question is maybe to Professor Ben-Sasson, from your experiences, in your political experience, how do you see where we are going? Because I think we all know that the petitions are already booked and written, and the court will probably disqualify what they're going to about the judicial committee. But what will be the response of the political system, not the citizens or the judiciary, but how the political system and the coalition will respond to this disqualification?
Regrettably, also, we only have 2 minutes left, and I need 30 seconds of them. So briefly, Rima, and then
There were some like by Knesset members like in the past, like Azmi Bshara, and who talked about all he actually he also ran for a presidency in 1994, 95, I don't remember. He also, tried to make a statement here, not for prime minister, position. And, they're trying sometimes like to impose different rules and show how that it should work differently. And he also talked about how also the percentage has also raised the threshold. It did change. And they also think that it has changed in order to make it harder for these small parties, especially the Arab parties, to enter the Knesset. Balad was out this time. It's not in the Knesset now. And this is why they created also the joint list, thinking also how to really overcome that predicament in terms of being more powerful, and united. And instead of, trying to struggle with all these, with the votes and how the distribution of the votes. But they do talk about these things. I'm not sure if they had any law or anything that submitted to the Knesset in the last few years. And that's, I have to check, definitely.
Unlike 2 months ago, I am more optimistic than I was before. Because there are always ways to find maybe 4 or 5 people from the back benches. There is a price and people negotiate it. B, when it comes to a real crisis, namely, as is described, Supreme Court decides, then the question is about obedience. And I think that majority will follow the Supreme Court, the court, and not the government. In this case, the government will pull back, as it happens nowadays in the demonstrations in the police instructions. They get it from the minister, they turn the back, they allow people to demonstrate the way we demonstrated for years. So I'm more optimistic, but you know how to make lemonade out of a lemon, it's a process. Not only a political process, but time, and people have to invest more, and involvement of the community is part of the optimistic feeling of myself, because the masses reflected unexpectedly more than they used to do, as Professor Kass started with.
I'm going to end today with, first of all, telling you all that, as we just heard, this is an unfolding process, and there will be a lot more from the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies and from Brandeis University on these and related topics. Let me highlight just a couple of them before ending, and the information will be in the chat for those watching online. First of all, tomorrow at 12:30, we are continuing our Sephardi modernity series relevant to the Mizrahi issues that were discussed today. Dr. Lital Belinko-Sabach of Hebrew University of Jerusalem will be speaking online about Judeo-Spanish proverbs. A little later in the semester, HBI, the Hadassah Brandeis Institute, is hosting its annual Diane Markowitz Memorial Lecture, and Dr. Yofi Tirosh will be speaking online and in person on the subject of populist regimes and plans to control women, the Israeli experience. That's on April the 19th at 7:30 p.m. And there are many other things which I'm not going to list now, but I do want people to know about the Schusterman Center's annual conference, which will be this year on Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Israeli community. It will start on April the 23rd with a free concert with the massive Ethiopian Israeli rock star Gili Yalo, and continue the next day on April the 24th with a series of academic panels and workshops. It now finally falls to me to close by, first of all, deeply thanking the staff of the Schusterman Center who put this magnificent event together. It was a lot of work, thank you. And of course, thank you so much to our distinguished panelists for navigating the very complex waters of this question. And thank you all for coming.